Welcome to the Monsters of Fantasy. This was written, produced, recorded, and edited by me, Sean McCarter. Monsters of Fantasy is a production in which I will explore the truly horrific side of the fantasy world known as Dungeons and Dragons. There are content warnings in the show notes below. Episode 6: The Banshee.
Hello. Before we get into the next statement, I think we should cover a few things. First is that Nico has returned to the castle. That doesn't really mean anything because he's still just as hard to track down even in his own castle. So, the day-to-day task of setting up this great catalog of monsters of his has still fallen on our shoulders. However, while he was out, he did modify the spell a bit. Instead of needing to use the room that he had etched the communication sigil into, I now have a handheld stone covered in runes. I just need to say the command word. Well, it's hard to show you, but this now means I can take my recordings on the go. Nico said this should help in case anyone gets lost again. They can continue their work throughout the castle. Well, continuing my work would be the least of my worries if I get lost in this maze. I do appreciate being able to record outside of this room, though. However, I will continue to use it, as it's sort of become my office. I've grown to appreciate the towering walls of scrolls and books that surround me. Now Nico has stated, and I want this on the record, Kez'Var, I don't care how you do it, it just needs to be done. And then he literally turned invisible. So I present to you an encounter with a Banshee, taken from Dr. Linseck during her time spent in the ethereal plane. Read by Kez'Var Gildair. The lives we live are infinitely small compared to the vastness of the universe. We live on what most academics call the material plane, and from all the studies we have gathered it seems to be limitless. The bounds of this domain can stretch forever. Then to tell you that there are different planes layered around ours that are equally infinite, well, you can see how it's impossible for me to describe the vastness of it all. But despite all of that, we still try to understand what's out there. We as a collective species have spent years trying to mark down and map the infinite. And luckily so, for if it were not for this innate curiosity that we have, then we would not know as much as we do about the other planes of existence. While the average person out there on the streets may not know of them, the existence of these other planes are now common knowledge amongst the educated. But there are still an infinite amount of things to find, to study, and learn. Also, if you happen to work for the king, to profit off of. Now, I'm not saying that in any mean way. King Athos is merely profiting off of our studies in the same way humanity will. All the understandings we bring back will be of great benefit. I never worried myself with how the monarchs used the knowledge we gave them. Most of the time it honestly only aided in advancing arcane knowledge. This helped the king's military just as much as it would help the rest of the kingdom. Now, I've never got to talk to the king. I was nowhere near that important. I've only twice gotten to speak to one of the king's arcane advisors, Archmage Talonflame, and that's only because he funded our expeditions into the unknown. You see, I went to the Bawai branch of the School of Arcana for my general studies. I showed signs of early arcane capabilities, and when someone from the capital came to test me, I had passed. My parents shipped me away at the age of 7 to go study under the brightest minds that might possibly have ever existed, all at the expense of quite literal life-binding contracts. Don't be alarmed. Until I turned 18, my parents were the ones under contract, at which point I got to make the decision to sign for myself, and see if I really want to continue my education past the general studies. I of course signed, pledging my loyalty to the king and being held in reserves in case we were to go to war, was a good trade-off for being given unlimited access to the entire history and future of Arcana. My advanced studies were spent in the extra-planar field, where I worked under Professor Magil. He was an older wizard who knew a lot about all the common dimensions and the various ways to get to them. Obviously knew of the ethereal plane up until that point, but I wasn't prepared for my first day. There were 5 others who started the course alongside me. I couldn't tell you all their names because I definitely don't remember the ones who didn't make it past the first day. I can tell you about Michael and his sister Molly, though. Michael Alavant was an ex-evocation specialist who, for the most part, was very quiet and kept to himself. The exact opposite of his sister Molly, who was outgoing, bubbly, and cheerful. I only learned these things after the fact because on that first day I couldn't be bothered with formalities. As soon as we were all seated at our desk of our own, Professor Magel appeared out of thin air. No puff of smoke, no exclamation. Just one moment the space in front of the classroom was empty, and the next it was filled with an old elvish gentleman. He had long white hair that was pulled back into a tight bun, except for 2 strands he let gently flow down the sides of his face. He was wearing long black robes that seemed to swallow his tall but thin frame. Covering the robe were tiny white specks, making it look like the night sky. There were even a few in the center of the robe that seemed to be a bit bigger and more brighter than the others. He was in mid-stride as if he were walking before suddenly showing up out of thin air. He strolled over and placed his spell tome on his desk. Not a loud thump to make us all jump or anything, but enough to get the attention of everyone who may have missed his entrance. Due to the immense silence that filled the room, I was sure that everyone was equally staring. He then turned to us and surveyed all of us. His eyes scanned each of our faces, but after a few seconds a smile split across his pale face, and he greeted us warmly. He then quickly turned the friendly introduction into a moment of learning by asking the class openly how we believed he had gotten there. I didn't want to seem eager, and I knew the obvious answer of invisibility couldn't be it. The class was geared towards the study of different planes. He obviously wanted us to make the connection. It was just as that thought crossed my mind, though, that one of the other kids had presented the invisible guess. However, before Professor Magel could respond, Molly had already blurted out that he was incorrect. Not in a condescending or rude way, but rather playful. She said, "Obviously, he came here through some form of extra-planar travel. Given the power needed for an expansive distance, and no spell circle there, I'm going to guess you were in the ethereal plane?" Professor Magel gave her a look of acknowledgement and a couple of soft claps. "Congratulations," he spoke to the room. "Can anyone here care to explain what the ethereal plane is?" I think I wanted to show off to him, or maybe it was the rest of the class, but I found myself talking. I told him how the ethereal plane, as I knew it, was the world in which dreams and wills exist, in a land slightly beyond life. I've seen it before, once or twice, through a true-seeing spell. I described how it was a gray, misty realm that bleeds over into our reality. That plane is also the home for the tormented souls that can't move on to their true afterlife. I also added, while I've never been into the ethereal, that I knew through arcane means one can enter there, and it sort of lets their bodies behave like a ghost, giving them freedom of movement with just the will of their minds. The same soft claps came again, but this time they felt a little bit harsher. He said I did pretty good for being mostly wrong, at which point he hopped off his desk he was sitting on and was practically dancing himself across the room while announcing to the class that I had only reached a fraction of what the ethereal plane was, and that I was merely describing the border ethereal, the plane that separates our world from the true ethereal. The true ethereal was supposedly a world of dreams and fragmented possibilities from all the inner planes that surrounded the prime material plane. And that's about where he lost me. He was talking about way more than I could comprehend at the time, and instead I found my eyes starting to drift about the room. Something I had yet to do. First was the large shelf that he lectured in front of. It stretched from wall to wall and contained 12 individual shelves that stacked all the way to the ceiling. I could spend hours staring and still not fully catalog its contents. I saw the standard charcoal, incense, and waxes that every arcane user would find himself needing. Almost an entire subsection of the shelf was set aside for magical papers and inks. Next to them was another subsection of quartz and materials harvested from the earth like diamonds and sapphires. It was here that I saw a little white and shining statue. At the time I couldn't quite piece it together that the elegant jewel-adorned elf depicted in the statue was indeed Professor Magel. I guess I wasn't the only one starting to zone out from the complexities of the Great Wheel cosmology. because he had clapped his hands together, drawing all of our attention to him. He looked at the class and cheerfully told us that he would have to show us then. He made us all stand in a semicircle around him, and then pulled us all within about a 10-foot radius. My eyes were getting lost in the galaxies imprinted on his robes, as he was announcing to the class to be very careful, and that if we did not listen to exactly what he said, we may die. I then looked up because I felt all my senses heightened, as I felt the flow of very powerful magic coming from Professor Magel. His eyes rolled back, but instead of white, I saw milky gray smoke replace his pupils. Then I felt the very strange sensation of my consciousness disassociating with my body. Except there was no body to disassociate from. Believe me, I checked. All around me I just saw gray smoke flowing through what I could only call an image of what I was. I saw the others were trying to adjust to their non-materialness like I was, except for Professor Magel. He looked so calm and poised, with his hair fully flowing into the gray smoke that surrounded his ethereal shape. I saw his mouth moving, but it sounded like we were deep underwater, and none of the words reached me. I only heard distorted echoes bouncing around. He then raised his eyebrows quickly, like he forgot something, and fiddled around in his robes. He pulled out a tiny vial. While holding the vial, I saw his hand trace a sigil into the air. Then, in the depths of our mind, he spoke to us. This is the border ethereal, the place you all call the home of ghost. But this is only where your reality touches the edge of the true ethereal plane, an actual different plane of existence, not whatever this is, he said as he floated around, gesturing to all the furniture and walls he was flying through. He stopped and looked at all of us. No, let us go to the real ethereal plane. And while I did not recognize the look in his eyes at the time, it was the look of someone who wanted to know what was at the end of this vast expanse of a world. Quickly, one of the other students had rebutted, and it seemed all too extreme to go onto another plane, that this was the first day, and he wanted to feel safe, as he glanced about wildly as if something were in the midst about to attack him. The professor reminded us in a firm but calm voice that we all signed the contract to pursue this education, and that we were all free to drop at any time and attempt another field of magic. However, he did remind us that we could not break ties totally from the establishment without them using a mind-blank spell on us. He said he would never manipulate us into doing something that we didn't want to do. He then contradicted himself in saying that he was right to think it was dangerous, though, and that from now on, every day we spend in pursuit of greater arcana, we will be spending it in danger. He said we should be aware of it and use our vast knowledge and power to protect ourselves from it. He had stopped floating around the room lazily and now hovered there ominously, letting the words sink in. I then saw the form of the kid who had asked the question fall back onto the prime material plane. I then watched him gather his things and leave. Except while he did so, Professor Magel kept talking as if it wasn't a big deal. He said that if anyone else wished to leave, all they had to do was will themselves to return to the material plane. He paused slightly to see if anyone else would follow his lead. He then said that's also how we moved here, at which point I noticed that no one else had really moved, but rather had stayed floating where we originally were. I slowly thought up, and I felt the parts of the misty fog that were me move up through the air. I tried the other directions, and sure enough, they worked. As soon as it seemed that we got the basics down of moving, though, I could tell Professor Magel was getting angsty. He clapped his hands together and said, "All right, now you know how to cast all your spells. You have access to the prime material plane. You also know how to move. So now is time to transcend across the folds of reality. The way to enter the deep ethereal, the true ethereal, is to just will yourselves there." He stretched out his hands in a wide motion as if praising towards the sky. He tilted his head back, but as he did so, the misty strands that were his hair had started disintegrating, becoming tiny colorful wisps of smoke that got absorbed into the gray torrent around him. And then we all watched as his extremities began to dissolve in the same colorful smoke. Within the span of seconds, Professor Madger was no longer in front of us. The only thing proving he was even there were tiny wisps of red and green that were now quickly fading away. I heard Molly let loose an expletive in my mind, and I glanced over to see that she was already disappearing as well. I saw the essence of Mike starting to shimmer too, and I stilled my mind. I didn't know what he meant by will yourself there. Where? I just thought about going somewhere? Somewhere more. I kept the singular thought of more. I wanted to explore every possibility in the world. I closed my mind, and on instinct, like a little kid wishing really, really hard for something, I thought more. I then felt not what I thought would be me fading away, but rather the feeling of becoming something more. I wasn't dissolving away, but rather I was becoming a part of the world around me. I felt my mind become one with the world around me, and then as soon as I started being comfortable with the idea that I was now just fog, I felt billions of particles that made my body funnel themselves back into the crude shape of Vivian Linseck. If you've never been to the true ethereal plane, then I fear I'll fail to describe what it's like. But I will try my hardest so you too can gain the taste to explore the infinite universes. I opened my eyes and the first thing I saw was the thick gray mist that consisted of the border ethereal was now spread out incredibly thin. Before I could only see about 60 feet in any direction, but here I could see out 500 feet into now light mist of silver. However, throughout the light mist, solid funnels of colored smoke would form and spiral off into the distance, fading into the sparkling abyss of glitter and colors. I was awestruck, and it seemed that Molly and Mike were also just as mesmerized because they were staring right past me with dumbstruck expressions. Then the half-elf materialized in front of me. He too was staring past Professor Madger and the twins, and he began to smirk as he looked out into the silvery mist. He started to turn slowly, but instead of meeting my eyes, he stared past me, and the smirk that was forming across his face quickly vanished as he dropped his jaw in amazement. I felt left out, being the only one facing the opposite way that we had entered in, and decided to shift my body around, and as soon as I made the conscious decision to do so, my body just turned around on its own. I felt my jaw open too. The class was floating about 10 feet from the edges of a giant curtain of smoke, the ends of which stretched well past my fields of vision. I couldn't even comprehend the size of what I was looking at. The wall consisted of swirling shades of red, gray, blue, and green that twisted and folded into each other with continuous and eternal patterns. I found myself staring at the wall, and I believe I would have been there forever if I didn't hear the professor touch my mind. This is the ethereal plane. We sat there floating and listening to Professor Madger for what seemed like only a few minutes, but could have very well been hours. The last student, Human, I guess got cold feet because he never materialized as Professor Madger told us how we were in the plane in which all other prime planes touched, the ethereal. He explained in no layman's way that essentially we were in the space that gods use to create things, and then place them wherever they wish to place them. He demonstrated this by telling us all to think of an object and try to make it exist. We all listened, and the light silvery mist began to fill my hands, taking the shape of a small apple. I went to bite into it, as Professor Madger suggested, but as soon as my teeth interacted with the apple, it burst into mist, fading back into the world around me. I saw the others attempting the same thing, except Molly. She was drawing some arcane sigils in the air. I recognized the spell she was casting. She was attempting to create a minor illusion in front of her, except instead of the shimmering image the spell normally creates, a really fully fleshed out apple appeared in front of her. She smiled at us. The professor congratulated her as he went on a tirade about how powerful conjuration magic was here, and about how some form of magics won't even work on this plane of existence. He said it had something to do with how the very existence we are experiencing was due to the limitless nature of possibility, thus making everything of creation real, or something like that. He explained that the more powerful magic, the more real the creations are, and longer they would last. Throughout this entire extra-dimensional speech, though, that half-elvish caster who materialized after me seemed to be only half paying attention, always glancing about into the fog. I'll admit that I don't have the best spatial awareness, but this kid seemed to be a lot more on alert than everyone else. He hesitantly whispered in all of our minds instead of out loud like we had been doing, that he was worried something was out in the mist. Professor Magel kind of chuckled. The chances of us encountering something like that are incredibly small. And, as if by some cruel joke from the gods that use this land as a sandcastle, the spectral form of a woman had materialized out in the emptiness, about 60 feet behind Professor Magel, and was quickly advancing towards us. It was obviously some ghost or something that was advancing towards us. However, from this angle it looked like a beautiful young elvish girl. Her hair was a long flowing beautiful white, and it fell gently across her translucent but still fair elvish skin. Aside from her spectral form, the only thing that signified her being undead was the large rip in her dress that she was wearing, as well as the gaping axe wound. But because there was no real muscle or blood, it was just a slit in the center of her chest that exposed not organs, but the void behind her. She looked mournful and sad, or so I thought. Maybe it was actually anger that she was trying to show us, but before I could discern any of that, the kid was already pushing past me, his face twisted in shock as he turned and fled away from the spectral creature. Michael looked annoyed and turned towards the creature and started rummaging around in his bag for a spell component. Molly, however, was already in the middle of casting a spell, something I had never seen before, but as she finished the incantation I saw pinkish arcane fields of force cover her and her brother's ears. This made our professor realize that something indeed was attacking us, and he decided to turn around just in time to see the woman unhinge her lower jaw and let loose a terrifying wail. I felt sharp needles rake across the inside of my skull, each shrilling octave of her scream penetrating deeper into the layers of my mind. I felt something seeping out of my ears. At the time I had no idea if it was blood or my actual brain tissue. Professor Magel, though, looked unfazed by the monster, and I watched in disbelief as he reached into the very designs of his robes and pulled out a shining star that he was holding in his hands. He crushed the orb of light in his hands, and seeping out from the spaces between his fingers, 7 beams of light collided with the ghostly woman, shredding her into pieces. The wailing had stopped, however her form started to shimmer back together. I didn't know what Michael was doing, but I noticed the nature of his spell was an offensive one. I took this as a chance to hinder the creature. I focused intently to conjure a tiny metal rod in my hand, and as soon as the mist turned into a malleable substance, I shouted at the woman to freeze in place. I saw my arcane chains wrap around her wrist in an attempt to paralyze her. However, despite being arcane, it just phased through her, having no effect. I turned to check on the half-elf who had run back towards the swirling curtain of smoke, and I noticed he was just floating there limply 5 feet away from the edge. I saw blood trickling from his ears, but due to the lack of gravity on this plane, it just looked like long, liquid strings of crimson that split off into his ears and mouth. I floated over to check his pulse. At the same time, I felt a mass of heat tickle my neck and then fade away. I flipped over the half-elf whose blonde hair was now coated in blood. His eyes were wide open in shock, pupils completely dilated. I checked his pulse and, sure enough, he was dead. I'm no expert, but my guess was that his heart had stopped from fear as the creature's shrill scream shredded his brain. I then heard the cheers and applause of the others as they presumably vanquished the spectral creature. I shouted at them all with my mind to come help, but I think deep down I already knew it was too late, that the guy in my arms was quite dead, and there was nothing we could do to save him. Class ended immediately after that, with Professor making us all return to the border ethereal, and then the prime material plane. As soon as we came to the material plane, he pulled a tiny wooden chest from his hands, whispered something under his breath, and then a small rectangular-shaped light opened up in the floor next to him. Out of it, a large version of the chest he was holding rose out of the ground, lid open. Professor Magel then threw the body in the chest, and said that he would see us all tomorrow, and simply vanished. As he did so, the chest slowly slid back into its white void. I stood there in shock. Molly simply smiled and waved as she hopped out of the room and said she'd see us tomorrow. Her brother gathered his things, and without a word he too left the class. Not knowing what else to really do, I went back to my dorm to reflect on my first day of higher education. The next day I showed up to class expecting some kind of speaker to be there, or at least a counselor to help those who needed it, but nothing like that happened. I just went back to the classroom that now only contained Michael, Molly, and Professor Magel. After an entire classroom of going over the mapped Great Wheel cosmology, I couldn't keep it together anymore, so I interrupted Professor Magel and asked him what happened to that young man. I don't know if it was some bad attempt at a joke, but he acted as if he didn't know what I was talking about, like he simply forgot it, like one forgets their hat at home. He raised an eyebrow and spoke absent-mindedly, saying that the young man had been resurrected at the nurse's office, and upon gaining consciousness decided to drop this course of study. When I kept asking him if there was anything we should do, he insisted I should come and see you. That's why I'm here. I waited a week, and it was still eating at me. He told me to come see you about the incident, and that it would be good if I gave you my story. End of story. It's nice having one end with no one actually dying, even more so considering the lethality of this entry. I do feel bad for those involved, though, especially that half-elf who seemed to not be named. However, this story came with a catalog of names that Daisy, being the oldest to ever worked with Nico, says she definitely met before, or at least there are more accounts that feature them. Despite what you say, Nico, about this being a catalog for monsters, we're having fun here at the castle, piecing together the different characters and friends you've met, especially Professor Magel. Both Cadwin and Daisy have said they've met him before and that he's just as mysterious, callous, and handsome as Dr. Linseck described. They said that they've seen him around the castle a few times. See, Nico, you do have friends. I bet you two are going off on adventures and still collecting those stories, huh? Well, I commend him, that Professor Magel. I've done a bit of planar travel back in my day, and I was not too fond of losing my sense of self. When you dematerialize and come back together in an unimaginable distance of space and time, are you actually the same person? Did that spell really put you all back? See, those are the things I never really liked about leaving the material plane. I'd rather not think about all that, so I just stay here. We did try contacting Professor Magel through a sending spell, and he said, and I quote, "You're with Nico, right? Ha ha, ha ha, ha," and then he expunged the spell's limit to continually laugh at Luna, who had casted it to him. Fun fact, though, while in the ethereal plane, you can just will yourself to another plane of existence, just by willing yourself in a direction. Now, this may sound like an easy mode of transportation, but it can take days, weeks, months to go where you want. And if you're blindly searching, well, that could take a lifetime in the infinite void. I know so because Nico noted down here that if anyone ever finds a Dominic Kane drifting in the empty void, that his corpse is likely carrying a ring of mind shielding. Banshee. Physiology. The Banshee is an undead humanoid that has failed to pass on to an afterlife. However, unlike the nasty vampire in the first entry, this undead is completely incorporeal. Typically, these ghost constructs are the spiritual remains of vengeful spirits, and after years of wandering in and out of the ethereal plane, they become more and more twisted, striking out at anyone rather than the thing that caused them to become vengeful in the first place. I'm going to start by first defining that the Banshee can occupy three separate spaces. The prime material plane, which is where we exist. The border ethereal, which is what we see when we cast a true sight spell. And then the deep ethereal, the realm that Dr. Linseck and company found themselves in. Most Banshees are on the prime material plane or the border ethereal, hunting and haunting their tormentor. It's rare that a Banshee would move into the deep ethereal unless it sensed the presence of souls beyond the shrouded veil that bordered the ethereal. Which is possible, but we'll get to that. So, if you exist on the same plane as the Banshee, then the following features apply. However, if the Banshee is residing in an alternate plane than you, well, there's nothing you can do to harm it outside of very, very powerful arcana. Because of their lack of body, they come with an entire fun set of immunities and resistances and whatnot, so pay attention. The Banshee is completely immune to spells that intend to charm or frighten an individual, as well as spells that try to hinder the physical body of an individual, like petrifying them to stone or paralyzing their limbs. Because of this, they also can't be exhausted or poisoned, and like many other undead monsters, they are immune to necrotic-based damage. And last, for complete immunities, any frost-based attacks will not hurt the creature. When I confronted Nico about why that was, well, he just shrugged his shoulders, vaguely gestured at the other pile of ghost entries, and then went into his personal studies. The only thing I've gathered is that any acidic, fire, lightning, or thunder damage will still harm the creature, but just like normal non-magical weapons, the harm done won't be significant. Those traits seem to be consistent across all of the ghost entries that we have, but where the Banshee differs is in its deadly abilities. Let's cover the one that I believe led to the unfortunate events that Dr. Linseck told us about. The Banshee has the magical ability to detect living creatures that are within 8 kilometers of it. It's not an exact pinpoint kind of tracking like Bartimaeus uses, but just an ongoing effect so it can detect its prey. This, paired with its incorporeal movement that allows it to traverse through walls and structures, means the Banshee can then confront its prey no matter where it tries to run or hide. Once it has found its prey, it will try and frighten the creature by entering its realm of existence. If simply seeing the Banshee doesn't invoke fear, then it resorts to the ability that gives it its namesake here. It will open its mouth and let out a horrifying wail. Aside from being absurdly loud and literally causing your brain to bleed out of your ears, the Banshee's wail is so frightening that it more often than not kills a normal man who hears it. Well, that has been another entry for your monster manual. Goodbye.
If you enjoyed today's episode, please share it with your friends and family. Follow us on Twitter at MonstersOf for all news and teasers for upcoming episodes. Today's story was an original and was inspired by the cosmic horrors of the deep ethereal. Join me next week as Kez'Var finds out what part is owl and what part is bear. Thank you for listening. Until next time.